Viveka died several months later, watching the rebirth of Zelem. And though it was but a snippet, a tiny shard of a word reminiscent of her home planet she'd never managed to quite forget, she was finally at peace. Happy, even. Okay, maybe that's going too far. Content, yes. She was content knowing that she'd kept her promise and gave her son a beautiful world to live in. She didn't care about the rest of the colony. Collateral beneficiaries, that was all. She'd left them on the outskirts of her enterprise, as they'd left her on the outskirts of their lives. That was how she wanted to be buried as well. On the outskirts. Just the two of them and the field, spanning over the once barren valley below the beautiful vantage point. It was gorgeous here, truly, up on the forest hill, surrounded by thick foliage shielding them from the stranger's eyes. One might argue, if you could call all the colonists by their names and had seen them daily for decades, they were not strangers anymore. But Viveka had disagreed. And so here they were. He, standing on the edge of the cliff overlooking the valley. She, lying in the cart behind him. Logically, Nevenna knew it was over and nothing would change it. Time moved only in one direction, and eventually he had to turn around and bury her. The passing of hours wouldn't change that fact. But the voice of logic was faint today, easily overtaken by the papery whispers of the field. They told him that as long as he stood here in his mother's company, the reality wouldn't have to come to pass. He'd had time to prepare for this. So much time. He'd thought he was ready. He'd sworn he was ready when she'd asked. Yet there he was, struggling to make a move, and no amount of cold logic she'd tried to instill in him seemed able to help him. It was a clutch in his throat, and an unpleasant twinge in the inner corners of his eyes that finally freed him from his delusional spell. Viveka had also taught Nevenna not to cry in front of others, even her. Or perhaps, especially her. She lay on the steel cot he'd pushed up this hill an hour or two ago. She was dead, but not lifeless. Nevenna's defective brain spared him the image of her stiff corpse. To him, her chest was still moving gently up and down. As she sunk into the wooden sarcophagus, she smiled a gentle smile of contentment, promising she won't be unhappy here. Nevenna let go of her live body and covered her with the blanket she'd fallen asleep in yesterday night. He touched her head in a brief stroke, no more than she would accept when she was still alive. And he said, "Thank you. Not just for this world." Despite the long hours that had passed since this morning, once the heavy lid fell down and locked in place, it felt like it had all been done in seconds. And it was only a shame that Viveka couldn't hear the rustling of the paper flowers through the wooden walls of her final resting place. Nevenna had thought he knew loneliness. In those long, dark evenings when he sat in the corner of Viveka's lap, waiting for her to scrounge up some time to spend together. Or in those long, bright days when he mooned around the school area watching his peers play. But he'd been wrong. He had felt lonely sometimes, but he was never alone, and that made all the difference. It hit him as he walked into his cottage. He thumped against the door as if a physical force pushed him back, and he slid down, his legs refusing to carry him anymore. The realization that his mother was truly gone incapacitated him, and for a while he struggled to even breathe. The tears he thought he'd cry wouldn't even leave his eyes, as if his tear ducts themselves became paralyzed. On his knees he crawled towards his bed, and from underneath it he pulled out a box where he always kept his diaries. But there was just one lonely notebook in this box, filled only with the recent drivel. The rest was still at home. The absence of people in the temporary truly shone the light on the grimness of the place. The makeshift structures that had served as houses and places of work just months ago now looked like discarded giant cardboard boxes. Nevene's imaginary neon lights flickered in tandem with any real lamp that was still on. The remaining backup generator wasn't able to keep it all going. If the surface colony got wiped off the face of the world right now, whoever came to this planet next would find a wealth of history lurking in the dark hallways of the warehouse complex. Whatever the colonists didn't need straight away had been left behind, waiting for better times. Disfigured furniture, built by amateur carpenters. Books read so many times they wouldn't even close anymore. Children artwork that parents were glad to accidentally forget. And trash. Loads of trash, patiently lying around in neat piles until someone bothered to escort it to the incinerator. Nevene took 2 turns and entered the hallway leading to his old home. He stopped for a moment before pushing the wooden pallet serving as a door. An awful feeling came over him. He felt home. But this shouldn't be home anymore. He walked up to the cardboard bookshelf in the corner. Every title on the drooping shelves felt like a shot of home away from home, too. These stories had been his escape from the fevers and the stomach bugs he had spent his childhood battling. Viveka had had to return most of the books she got for him to the common library, but those still here were Nevene's favorites, and she'd found a way to keep them somehow. It hurt to remember it now that she was gone. Nevene grabbed his box of diaries and sat down on the bed, trying to shoo away the feeling of comfort of being where he belonged. Somewhere on those pages of ramblings he had to have mentioned someone he'd once known, who could make this feeling of loneliness go away somehow. A bond to build, a friend to be. It wasn't a name that he found, though, but a word. Father. In an entry from almost a decade ago, there was a mention of the short talk young Nevene had with Viveka about his father. She'd said he wasn't in their lives and never would be, then made it clear it wasn't a topic she wanted raised again. As Nevene got older, he figured they must have split in some unpleasant or embarrassing circumstances, something his mother would never live down. Now, though, the man could be the only family Nevene had left. He had to find out who he was. Viveka wasn't here to be furious anymore. He dropped the diary on the bed and rushed out of the old home. There was a city hall in the temporary, a makeshift one, of course, but if there was a census anywhere, it might still be there. Birth certificates, death certificates. All of it. Nevene found the room with the documents. The terminal had been taken to the surface, but most of the data had been backed up in paper form. The archives, proud as it sounded, weren't all that majestic. With just over 200 people, living rather dull lives around here, there wasn't that much to chronicle. At least the furniture in the area was built by one of the actual carpenters, not bored hobbyists. Even the wobbly chair seemed to wobble by design. Nevene grabbed a table lamp and plugged it into the outlet. The thing cracked in protest, but then obediently lit the shelves. He skimmed through the book spines and found the one he needed. The purple tome was sandwiched between the history of communications with the homeland and the notes on agricultural innovations. No rhyme, no reason. Nevene picked it out and carried it to the wobbly chair. There had been quite a few kids born after the colony had arrived on this planet. Not enough for a proper population replacement, but a fair bunch. His certificate, 19 years old, should be somewhere in the middle. And it was. He found it without a hitch. What he didn't find was the name of his father. The field was there, as it was on all the other children's documents, but it was blank. Nevene scowled and started to check all the other certificates, and every single one of them had names of both parents put in. Why didn't his? He stared at the page as if the name would appear because he wanted it to, needed it to, but no. Not even a manufactured hallucination wanted to fill this void. He dropped the useless book and kicked it to the side. Somehow, during the short walk from his old home to the archives, he'd managed to convince himself that this was the thing he needed the most, and that he would be all right once he got it. He took a deep breath. It wasn't over. He would find out who the man was, and he would find out why they'd kept it from him. The other book on the shelf, Communications with the Homeland. It was as good a start as any. Who knew what he could dig out of Zelem's past? He meant to pull it out with some force, and his hand jerked back. The book was way lighter than it looked. Soon, Nevene found out why. Half of it was gone, ripped out. He thumbed the jagged stumps of the missing pages. They hadn't been removed with care nor precision. Someone straight up tore them out of the thing and called it a day. There was just one single entry present on the new opening page, dated shortly after the dome's malfunction. It contained a simple request for help, and an even simpler refusal. That was all. Nevene knew little about how the communications with the home planet looked like. They'd ceased before he was born, and nobody talked about them. Ever. Maybe they'd all been so concise. He never thought much of the colonists not mentioning Zelem's relationship with the home planet, because he simply assumed there was just not much to mention. It was in the past, and people had little reason to return there. Yet now that he held this mold book in his hands, it was impossible not to see the connection. It did not seem like the past fading away, overtaken by life in the present. It was a sudden rip, meant to erase this past from history. What happened to the 11 messengers sent off to ask for help? Why had they only returned this impersonal refusal? The whole point of sending them out was to make sure they could fight for help for Zelem, not to be ignored like a simple message could be. Nothing was making sense. The pillars upon which Nevene had built his whole understanding of his life and purpose were crumbling, revealing cracks he'd never before seen. One secret after the next. He was beginning to doubt everything he knew. Viveka had lived through whatever removed pages spoke of, yet she never talked to Nevene about it. And if he couldn't even trust her? No. This was not the place he should be. He came here searching for solace, but found only fuel for anxiety. He dropped the ruined book and ran out of the archives. He wanted out. Out of what exactly? He didn't know. But the first step was getting back on the surface, to this promised land spanning under the dome, to the new life he had to love. When he reached the valley, the sobs came at last. They drowned quickly in the symphony of paper-like rustling rolling through the field with each gust of the afternoon breeze. Nevene walked into the flowers, careful not to damage any of them. They were tall, but not tall enough, still leaving him a part of the outside, and he didn't want to be a part of anything. And so he fell to his knees and hid between the forest of grey stems. As the wind blew, they swayed with it, patting Nevene gently from all directions. He rolled up the leg of his trousers and began to scratch the ever-itchy scar left after Viveka had sampled the skin graft from his shin. It got worse when he was stressed, but it also brought relief when he closed his eyes and focused on the painfully pleasant sensation of digging his nails into the spot. Looking back, he knew this was the moment he formed his bond with the field. He never much believed in the immortality of human essence, but Viveka had put her soul into the creation of it, and Nevene managed to convince himself that some part of her lived on within it. He would return here many times in the following months to hide away and give in to the gentle tapping and the hum, to become one with the flowers and escape from the world and his own self.